Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. Barring no more notices of motion, we'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. Time is now 2:31. We'll conclude at 3:31. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Yesterday in this House, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Energy tabled a document which he described as having been just published, and I will table that quote from Hansard yesterday. In that document it says that onshore coal bed methane has a potential of 3.9 trillion cubic feet as compared to only 650 billion for shale gas. Well, Mr. Speaker, that information actually came from a report published not just recently, but in 2003. That is 11 years ago. Mr. Speaker, of course we have a more recent estimate of shale gas potential from the Wheeler report, a report published in 2014, not 2003. And in that report, Mr. Speaker, they estimate the potential of shale gas in Nova Scotia at 10 trillion cubic feet. Mr. Speaker, shale gas is an important way to develop new jobs in our province. I'd like to ask the Premier, will he assure the House that his government did not decide to ban shale gas development based on an 11-year-old report?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I can assure the member opposite that this government is doing its due diligence to ensure that every decision it makes is in the best interest of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and we are using real facts based on today's, Mr. Speaker, the reality that are facing Nova Scotia today, not some fairyland that the Leader of the Conservative Party is living in.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I see we're striving to the high level of debate again today that people expect of Nova Scotians. Of course, I just tabled every fact from its source document that it comes from, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Energy tried to dismiss shale gas development based on an 11-year-old report, a report that he described as, and I quote, just published. The 2014 Wheeler report, Mr. Speaker, estimates that shale gas development could create up to 1,500 jobs in our province. That's a 2014 estimate, not 2003. Mr. Speaker, why did the Premier's government ignore the Wheeler report using actual data from 2014 when 1,500 potential jobs are at stake?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a matter of fact, we followed exactly what the Wheeler report said, Mr. Speaker, is that there need to be more study, there need to be more science. That's why we're investing, Mr. Speaker, in more science to identify if the actual resource is here, where it is, what's the location. Mr. Speaker, the bill before this House lays out very clearly a process when it comes to hydraulic fracturing and shale formation, that there has to be a public debate with Nova Scotians. Why is the Leader of the Conservative Party so afraid to engage Nova Scotians in a conversation about their future?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very encouraged to engage Nova Scotians in a debate instead of banning it altogether. One Nova Scotian that I'd be very interested to hear from is actually Dr. Wheeler himself. He's a Nova Scotian and an expert in this field who spent a long time studying this very topic, so I hope we do hear from him. But I will say, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the Premier mentioned science, because he did yesterday also mention science, and he said in this House, and I quote, that the government is going to base its decisions on science. Well, that is good news. Interestingly, Mr. Speaker, the science in the Wheeler report, the 2014 science, not the 2003 science, says about coal bed methane, the minister's favourite gas, that projected volumes of coal bed methane are small relative to those in unconventional gas and oil wells. In other words, shale gas, Mr. Speaker. So I'll ask the Premier, will the Premier return to science-based decision-making, withdraw his ban on shale gas development using 2014 science, not 2003?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Minister of Energy to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
You know, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the data yesterday came from this month's Natural Resources magazine, which was published yesterday. The data, and Mr. Speaker, and in fact at the core conference yesterday, which unfortunately the official opposition didn't bother to attend, unlike when we were in official opposition, we always made it a priority because we felt that that industry was a priority. Mr. Speaker, no, our caucus paid for it ourselves.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Energy has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things that was brought out was in fact that the data that was in Natural Resources magazine is actually widely accepted by many in the industry as one of the resource estimates. The other is a possible resource estimate, and the Wheeler Commission talks about the fact that in both cases they are speculative, which is exactly why this government is doing the onshore atlas to determine what the real potential is. You know, Mr. Speaker, I have acknowledged publicly that there are many different estimates, and the point of yesterday's discussion was around the fact that this party seems to think there are no onshore opportunities, when in fact the ones that industry are actively going after in this province at the moment, the ones that are most furthest advanced in this province at the moment are coal bed methane, just like the one in Stellarton that is flaring, and the first one in this province's history.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Education, Labour and Advanced Education, signalled to students, staff and faculty in the university system that it's not sustainable. And she said, and I quote, "Taxpayers already invest $500 million in post-secondary education every year. If things don't change, universities will need $50 million more in funding in a few short years." So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is really quite simple. Does he agree with his Minister of Labour and Advanced Education that our university system is not sustainable?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank the Minister for the tremendous work that she's been doing on behalf of the people of this province. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in a very long time, we're having university presidents not tell us, but tell all Nova Scotians that they have a government that they want to work with, that is cooperative with, that actually sees a future for post-secondary education institutions in this province. Mr. Speaker, a government that not only sees them as a great educational institution, but ones that will drive economic development from one end of this province to the other, unlike the experience of the 4 years under the Democratic Party, where they cut $70 million out of post-secondary education.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has announced yet another review, this time a review of the university system. Mr. Speaker, there was a comprehensive review of that system done in 2010 by eminent scholar and well-respected economist Dr. Tim O'Neill, a report on the university system. And he made recommendations, and many of those recommendations resulted in a number of changes. For example, our outdated student loan program, which was the worst in the country, is now the best, and tuition was capped at or below the national average. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier if he'll commit to ensuring that tuition hikes will not be the method his Liberal government uses as his government seeks ways for our universities to become more sustainable.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure her that this government actually sees a future of post-secondary education in this province. We see it is a wonderful opportunity to drive economic development from one end of the province to the other. The member just introduced member just introduced a bill that references, Mr. Speaker, research and development. If you've been following the debate in this province, how excited university students are. First time in a very long time in our history that we've invested in research grant opportunities for university students to find their first job here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Those are all good news, and we're looking forward to continue the dialogue with university presidents and student union representatives across this province to ensure that universities are affordable in this province and one that's sustainable in the long run.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I heard no commitment to deal with the ever-rising and increasing cost of a university education in that answer. Mr. Speaker, university administrators need to know that increasing tuition fees, student debt loads is not the way to make the system more sustainable. It only offloads the cost onto our young graduates and burdens them for many, many years, Mr. Speaker, sometimes driving them out of our province. Mr. Speaker, it's also the case that non-permanent members of faculty, teaching assistants, and those term and sessional teachers earn deplorable wages in our universities. These are well-trained, well-educated men and women academics. And so I want to ask the Premier if he will assure Nova Scotians that his government will not allow the administrators in universities to exploit the non-permanent members of the university faculty as his government looks for sustainability in the university system.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the leader of the Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker, we have faith in the men and women who are running our post-secondary institutions. That question, Mr. Speaker, leaves no doubt in the mind of any Nova Scotian why that government took an assault when it came to post-secondary education under their administration, Mr. Speaker. We see it as an asset. We see it as building the future in this province. Unlike that government, it saw its place to cut.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. On April 18, 1996, a tragic car accident changed Joellen Huntley's life forever and that of her family. In the accident, Joellen suffered traumatic brain injury that has left her unable to walk or talk. She uses a feeding tube to live and she is a long-term patient at King's Regional Rehab Centre. The family uses a court award to pay for such things as a better wheelchair, more comfortable bed and physiotherapy that the rehab isn't able to provide, even with its excellent care. Now the province has sent Joellen's family a bill for her care. It is taking them to court for the money. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, why is the Minister's Department going after Joellen's insurance money retroactively, which dates back to her accident dates back to the time before the provincial policy to go after these kinds of settlements even existed?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite not only for the question but for the work that he has been doing on behalf of the family. This is a tragic situation which happens to many different families throughout Nova Scotia, including my own. I won't speak before to the specific case as it's still before the courts, but I will give you an experience that can help relate to the decisions of the province. I lost my own mother to a car accident in 1999, and I buried her with the insurance money that she had most diligently bought for such purposes if her life had ended. She also had a clause in her insurance that if something devastating were to happen to her because of a car accident or any other accident, that I, as her only child, would have an insurance settlement to provide for her primary care, which I would have done. If I had gone beyond that insurance settlement, because Nova Scotia is a generous and compassionate society, we take care of persons who need our help, that are in our rehabilitation centres, that are in our hospitals, that go far and above what the cost of care is for most patients that have comprehensive, unique needs. So the cost of care is regrouped when there is ability to pay, and that's why insurance is purchased in this province, and that's why people are able to contribute to the cost of care. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North on his first supplementary.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate her personal remarks. My family, too, has suffered a tragic car accident which resulted in my brother being killed in that through a brain injury, and I was talking with Louise driving down today about that, and I do recognize the excellent care that the province is providing for Joe Ellen. What I would like to point out is that the family is using this money in the settlement to provide for extra care for Joe Ellen above and beyond what the province is able to do. And one of the things that Louise related to me coming down this morning was that earlier this summer, Joe Ellen actually had what's called an eye movement test and scored 90% on that eye movement test, which opens up the possibility of communicating with her for the first time in 18 years. And through the use of sensory computers that track eye movement. And that's a possibility of communication which I believe would not have been there had there not been this extra settlement money that her family is able to use. So I just want to ask the Minister, given this sort of a case, would she not recognize that the family has the opportunity to provide these extra services in this situation, and would she not acknowledge that?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I have complete confidence in the medical professionals that are in that facility down the valley, and in fact across every facility in Nova Scotia that care for comprehensive cases. And I know that primary care has a very strategic and strenuous medical care package, and each case is managed for the optimistic outcome for each patient, and I'm confident that that is the case in every situation that is currently in our rehabilitation centres.
The honourable member for Kings North on his final supplementary.
I would like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one final comment is that one of the elements of this situation is that the family has offered to to give money to the Kings Regional Rehab Centre, to the provincial government, and the provincial government has declined that offer. So my question to the Minister is, why not settle this out of court with the family when the family has given every indication they're willing to work with the department?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
As noted before, I can't comment on anything that's going on before the courts, but I will talk about the cost of care, not in this case, but in most cases in Nova Scotia. They can range from anywhere between $90,000 to $150,000, $160,000 per year. And as I said before, the province of Nova Scotia is generous. We have a responsibility to families to make sure that care is provided, and in instances where insurance settlements or other benefits can be contributed to that cost of care, that's why that particular piece of legislation is there. We care for people whether they're in a tragic situation for a month or if they live for 50 or 60 years, because that's the right thing to do, and that's what the people of Nova Scotia expect in a government, and that's what they expect with good use of their taxpayer money.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you again is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, we were talking earlier about the Tim O'Neill report on higher education and some of the recommendations in that report. And some of the recommendations in that report, Mr. Speaker, talked about administration in the university system, something we all have a great interest in talking about, and I know the Premier does as well. With 10 institutions of higher learning, that requires a great deal of administration. So my question to the Premier is this: what thought has the Premier given to reducing administrative costs in our university system and the recommendations of the O'Neill report with respect to administration in the university system?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell all members of this House how fortunate we are for the men and women who are managing and running our universities across this province. Mr. Speaker, to a person from the day we became government until today, we have been received by them with open arms in a conversation that recognizes there are challenges facing every institution across this province. Things have to change. They want to be part of the dialogue. They want to be part of the solution. And, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, we need them to be part of the conversation, and we need them as a province not only to continue to drive top quality education for our sons and daughters, for sons and daughters across this country. Mr. Speaker, they are one of the best immigration tools that we have in all of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we have 20,000 young people who are coming here from post-secondary institutions, and the men and women who are in charge of administration of those universities want to be part of the solution, and this government is talking with them to find a long-term, sustainable model that will work for all of us.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, and I agree that we are fortunate to have the universities that we have in the province. They are an asset. But that does not mean, Mr. Speaker, that there aren't challenges. And I'm somewhat puzzled by the Premier's response. You know, this is a Premier that has invested a great deal of his efforts into reducing administration in the healthcare sector, yet he doesn't seem to have the least bit of interest in looking at the administration in our post-secondary education sector. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Premier whether or not he has any plans in mind to look at the administration in the university system, even just to get an understanding of the extent to which there is administration in that system, to the extent that it may be top-heavy in that system, to the extent of the amount of resources that it may absorb in that system that don't go toward the classroom, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure where the leader missed this answer, but we are in consultation with the university sector, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we're looking at administration as we're looking at every other aspect of providing the educational opportunities there for our sons and daughters, looking at opportunities to drive economic development through research, Mr. Speaker. These institutions are economic drivers for the communities that they're in, but like every institution in this province, Mr. Speaker, of course we have to look inward to ensure that the dollars that are being spent in the most cost-effective way, and we're doing that by engaging the university presidents to ensure that we work together to make sure that the long-term viability of these institutions is sustainable for all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table a little chart here on the university's top-level administration in our system. Mr. Speaker, there are 10 presidents, 28 vice presidents, 35 associate vice presidents. That's 63 people, Mr. Speaker, totaling well over $10.5 million annually in salaries alone, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, this is the tip of the iceberg. Students and faculty, I'm sure, think some of these resources could and should go into the classroom. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this: what is he going to do with the number of top-level administrators in our university system?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with this line of questioning, it is no wonder that that party, when in power, attacked post-secondary institutions. Had no imagination about the possibilities of creating good jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker, through research and development, through the economic opportunities that are being driven by those institutions. had no concept at all, Mr. Speaker, on how to retain some of those 20,000 sons and daughters from across Canada and around the world that come here for one reason alone, Mr. Speaker. They come here, Mr. Speaker, because of our university sector. We're going to continue to work with the men and women who are charged with running those organizations to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that they are sustainable for the long run, unlike the NDP party, Mr. Speaker, who did nothing but try to kill post-secondary education in this province.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Premier said that his government was more open and transparent than the last government, and he challenged members to bring issues around freedom of information requests to the floor of this Assembly. Now, in July, the PC Caucus office submitted a FOIPOP request for correspondence and government money given to Nova Star Cruises because, Mr. Speaker, we all know the Yarmouth Ferry has been a hot topic. In August, our office received a reply, and I'm going to table this, and the reply asked for almost $15,000 to supply the information. So, Mr. Speaker, if the government believes in being open, why are they sending out bills of upwards of $15,000 for information that should be public and readily available?
The honourable minister responsible for the Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question from the member across the floor. Under the Freedom of Information Act, there is actually a cost associated with gathering information, and the cost actually is only about a couple dollars for every hour we need to put in. So as people in this province, and most of the Freedom of Information Act, most of the requests for Freedom of Information Act actually come from political parties. As they put in more and more requests, it is costing government a lot of money. So the $20,000 would actually have cost government about $120,000. And unless the member has a suggestion as to how we can provide that information at zero cost, I'd be interested to hear him.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the amount I mentioned was actually close to $15,000, the cost. Mr. Speaker, there might be some hope here for some change. The FOIPOP process is intended to be independent and free from political influence, and all parties have submitted requests in the past, so the member can say what he wants, but every political party has submitted requests in the past. Nova Scotia was the first province in Canada to enact access to information legislation. It was designed to prevent political interference in situations where information and privacy issues would be debated on the floor of the legislature. So my question, will the minister support greater transparency by changing the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act process to ensure it is free from political influence in government?
The honourable minister responsible for the Freedom of Information Act.
Thank you for the question from the member across the floor. Under the Freedom of Information Act, Mr. Speaker, the information that is provided is readily provided. Where I think the opposition party is having some frustration is when requests come into government that are very broad-based, then what we need to do under the Act is actually price out how many man-hours and employee hours would take to fulfill that request. In this instance, where the request was $15,000, the actual amount of hours to put out that request would have cost government over $100,000. My suggestion is when you read the Act, if you can be a bit more specific in your questioning, then we can drill into exactly what is being looked for, and then we can provide that information. But when there's Freedom of Information Acts that come in that are very broad-based, then the response is going to be 50, 60,000 pages worth of documents. And then there's going to be staff people who are actually in the process finding those documents. And what that does is it, unfortunately, puts so much into the queue that other requests that are coming in cannot be met because we have essentially a big chunk of government just fulfilling Freedom of Information Act requests. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I respect what the minister is saying, and makes a good point. But I think what might give a little more confidence to the system is if we had somebody independent. And, during the election campaign, the Premier said he would take action to make Nova Scotia the most open and transparent province in Canada. And we have a recommendation that may help to assist with that. We recommend that the FOIPOP review officer be made an officer of this legislature. That way, it would remove any potential political interference, perceived or otherwise, from the review process. And it could help to narrow down these requests so that they're not so broad. So, Mr. Speaker, I will ask the minister, will he accept the Premier's election promise and move ahead with this recommendation to make the FOIPOP review officer an officer of the legislature?
The honourable minister responsible for the Freedom of Information Act.
Mr. Speaker, I'll give you an example of a Freedom of Information Act request that came in, and the only reason that I was privy to it is because the request was for my expense reports. I will assure the opposition and all people in Nova Scotia that the Freedom of Information Act in the province of Nova Scotia under a Liberal government is free from political interference. Let me repeat that. Free from political interference. Mr. Speaker, a prime example, and the only reason I'm privy to this is because what was being FOIA-popped was my expense report. The request that came in asked for my expense reports from the day I was sworn in until today, my executive assistants, and my deputy ministers. So what we had to do, we actually had staff pulling out expense reports for the last year, and then I got a stack of documents on my desk which I had to review to make sure were factual because it was my office that was being FOIA-popped. When you have this request going across every department in government, it is no doubt that the system is getting gummed down. So as people make freedom of information requests, they should try to be a bit more specific. And if they're I'll keep talking. And if the requests are coming in, if the requests are going to come in so broad-based because it's a fishing expedition, then this is the result that's going to happen. I'd urge the members across the floor, perhaps if they can be a bit more specific, they can get the information they're looking for. But as long as they're going to be on fishing expeditions, they're never going to find a thing.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Premier. This week, when I asked the Minister of Environment if he would deny approval to any proposal that would reopen the Sackville landfill, he implied that it's okay for Halifax to waste their taxpayers' dollar on a reopening proposal, but when it comes to the province, it's not worthy of the Minister's valuable resources. So I'd like to ask the Premier...
Order, please. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid has the floor.
Does the Premier agree with the Minister's approach to dealing with this important issue that would affect my community and the communities of several members of his own caucus?
The honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think what I'm not even sure what the member's asking, but I can tell you what the Minister of Environment said yesterday. There was actually no proposal, no request before his department, Mr. Speaker. And with all due respect to the Democratic Party, they lost the election. The new government does not meddle in the affairs of another level of government, Mr. Speaker. Municipal politicians across this province have been duly elected to represent their constituents, to make the decisions that fall under their purview. We're going to do the job that we've been asked to do, which is manage this province. I would encourage him to contact the member of the municipal government to deal with this issue.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Mr. Speaker, ultimately it lands on the minister's desk. So it does, Premier. You're mistaken, Mr. Premier. It belongs on the desk of the minister. If they choose to change the proposal that is there, the province has to approve it, Mr. Speaker. All I'm asking, Mr. Speaker, that if they do make that proposal change, that the minister should agree now if they agree with it or not. Why would you allow the taxpayers of the municipality, there's only one taxpayer in this province, go through this process over the next almost year when the minister could stop it now if they agree with it? I know the Premier's caucus members are concerned with this, Mr. Speaker. This week the minister told us that he doesn't operate on the world of hypothetical situations. But, Mr. Speaker, when the municipality is hosting public meetings, having debate at council, has hired consultants and have received recommendations, how would this, to the Premier, how would this be a hypothetical situation?
The honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this issue may never end up on the desk of the Minister of Environment, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member knows that. This is something that's happening at the municipal level. I encourage him to call his municipal representative. I encourage him to call the mayor if he so chooses. But let me assure all members of this House that whatever lands on the desk of the Minister of Environment, it will be dealt with, Mr. Speaker, in a respectful manner, looking at all Nova Scotians, and it will be done so, Mr. Speaker, through the regulatory eye of the Department of Environment.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, through you to the Premier, no one's asking the Minister to spend any money. No one's asking the Minister to appoint a special envoy to the Highway 101 landfill, Mr. Speaker. All we're asking for is him to send a letter or make a phone call. So I'd like to ask the Premier, if the Minister is unwilling, will the Premier make the right decision for his minister and tell the municipality the province would never entertain reopening the Sackville landfill? The municipality needs the approval from the province. Why don't they tell them what they think of it right now?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, he's being nice to me, I hear. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Environment has a tremendous amount of work to do across this province. He's been doing a tremendous job on behalf of the people of this province. I've been extremely grateful and proud of the fact that he stepped up a year ago, was elected, accepted the appointment to the Executive Council, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker has shown great leadership on so many files, Mr. Speaker, from dealing with issues that were left at the desk by previous ministers under the former government that were unwilling to act, unwilling to go out and engage communities on the very things that they had some control over, Mr. Speaker. Instead, Mr. Speaker, there's little wonder why other levels of government had no respect for the previous provincial government, because all they were spending their time was meddling in things that were not their responsibility. If this issue or any other issue arise at the desk of the Minister of Environment, Mr. Speaker, he will deal with it in the same professional manner that he's dealt with every other issue through the eyes of the regulatory environment here in the province.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Education. Despite repeated promises to the contrary, for the second fall in a row, students at Dr. W. McLeod Consolidated School in Riverton returned to study in windowless classrooms. The windows could have and should have been installed during the summer months while the building sat empty, but they weren't. And the result is students are now unnecessarily going to school in a construction zone. Mr. Speaker, the students of Dr. W. McLeod School deserve better. Does the Minister agree that the students of Dr. W. McLeod School do deserve better and that this work should have been done during the summer months?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. I have had a chance to visit W.A. McLeod during the summer when the construction crew was there. We recognized early on, when we put $15 million into a maintenance capital program, that schools would be able to use that, boards could apply for that, and dollars were given, as the member would know, to Chignecto for that particular project. And the calling of the tender, the awarding of the tender, and the management of the work was responsibility of the school board.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer there. But after having all summer to get this work done, the tender for installing additional windows was not closed until August 14th, with the successful bidder chosen on August 18th. Red tape ensured that the summer construction season was lost. Mr. Speaker, this tender should have been issued much sooner, should have been awarded much sooner, and the work could have been done. The students and staff deserve answers. So my question for the Minister is, why did the department sit idly by instead of impressing upon the board the need to get the tender out, awarded, and the work started?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, we recognize that having students in a construction environment is not the most favourable place. It's something that we would like to avoid. And unfortunately, we have school boards who make decisions that really would not be our decisions, but it is within their purview. And we certainly have been in communication with the Chignecto board on WA, as well as New Glasgow Junior High or P28 School, and we are encouraging them to respect and consider the safety of the students during construction periods. We encourage them to do that construction during the summer. That time ran out. I'm not happy about that. We encourage them to do work in the evenings and weekends. I understand that is happening, but the safety of the children in the school is our paramount concern.
The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the answer. That might be the first answer I ever actually got in a question period, so thank you very much to the Minister. On Tuesday, I'm serious. That's a good answer. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, the Dr. W.A. McLeod School Advisory Council sent a letter to the Schenectady Regional School Board, which the minister was copied, and I'd be happy to table that. It said that the School Advisory Council believes that renovations that should make the existing elementary school a standard P-8 school are not being fulfilled as promised. And with so many broken promises in the past, I understand their concern, and the School Advisory Council is concerned that necessary educational elements, such as proper fitness and tech ed facilities, have been delayed and might be excluded from the project. And the letter goes on to say that we want the board and the province to understand that this is not acceptable. So my question today is, will the minister assure the parents and students that their school will get the renovations they're promised and that anything less is indeed not acceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member and to the School Advisory Council. I would like to congratulate the School Advisory Council for taking on the role for which they were designed. School advisory councils are there to lobby and act on behalf of the students, and going to their school board representative, going to their elected member, and going to the administration is exactly what SAC school advisory councils are designed to do. But I will tell the member that when I receive the letter, I certainly will respond to that school advisory council.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, in the Liberal platform, it promises that the government will drive down energy rates, and I will table that. But, Mr. Speaker, according to a recent Chronicle Herald article, Nova Scotians who rely on firewood as a primary home heating source are facing an almost 10% increase in costs. So my question for the Minister of Natural Resources, what steps has he taken to keep the government's promise to lower energy rates for those who use wood to heat their homes?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for clarity's sake, the commitment that was made in the platform was related to people's electricity rates. Just for the clear of the House so everybody knows that. What's going on with the firewood market right now? The prices are going up. That is a result of factors that are happening in the private wood market, Mr. Speaker. Primarily, over the course of the last 10 years, we've had a retraction in the forestry industry. There's less contractors. That means there's less people going out and cutting the wood. We've also had a long winter last year, which has compounded the problem for this year, Mr. Speaker. What we're able to do is what we've tried to do to address the situation and increase the flow of firewood is open up Crown tenders, Mr. Speaker, particularly in the West. Unfortunately, on 3 of those Crown tenders, there were no bids in the counties of Kings, Queens, and Shelburne. And that is a symptom of the fact that there's just not enough contractors to supply the current demand that's in the marketplace.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a sad, pardon the pun, but that is cold comfort. And I'll table the tenders because, and I've talked with the wood suppliers, and they simply, I can't use the words in here, but they simply call that tendering process garbage or window dressing. Mr. Speaker, right now across Nova Scotia is facing firewood shortage, which has led to a $20 per cord increase on the price. Mr. Speaker, in a recent Queens County Advent story, several firewood suppliers spoke out about the current government lack of willingness to address the problem. In fact, one firewood supplier told the publication that he called the local MLA for help, including the MLA for Lunenburg West 4 times. I repeat, 4 times. But the one person who returned the call was the MLA for Queen Shelburne. So, Mr. Speaker, what these suppliers have told me is that the few tenders the minister put out for firewood are nothing more than window dressing. So my question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister of Natural Resources, why has he refused to work with South Shore firewood suppliers to address this current shortage?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, our government's concerned of the current state in the firewood marketplace. We've heard from constituents across the province that are having a hard time accessing firewood and that have identified that the prices have gone up. That's true. It's a result of factors that are happening in the private marketplace, Mr. Speaker. Just for clarity's sake, 80% of the firewood supply in this province comes off of private land, not Crown land, Mr. Speaker. Our ability to interfere in these current market factors are limited. It's very easy during times of stress when people are concerned about heating their homes to point fingers and lay political blame. It would be just as easy for me to point the finger at the member opposite and say the reason there's no firewood in the marketplace is because of the large green metric tonnage that they gave to Northern Pulp, Mr. Speaker. But to do so would be disingenuous because, in fact, this is not a problem that was caused by any particular government. It's a challenge that the current marketplace is facing because there's been a retraction in that marketplace and there's currently not the contracting capacity to get out there and cut the wood that needs to be cut.
The Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite needs a quick history lesson. The Bowater land was purchased for recreational use and for commercial use, which includes firewood access. Mr. Speaker, this winter it's going to cost families along the South Shore more to heat their homes, and I'm concerned some homeowners will be forced to burn green wood, which we all know poses a health and a safety issue, safety risk. Mr. Speaker, in today's Crown land allocation announcement, the minister made no mention, I repeat again, no mention of firewood for firewood suppliers. So my question for the minister, why did he did not address the firewood shortage as explicitly giving firewood suppliers access to Crown lands as part of today's Western lands allocation?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, our government did release tenders specific for firewood in the summer. There were some bids that were placed in various counties. There were 3 where there were no bids placed on those tenders, Mr. Speaker. Queen, Shelburne, and Kings County were the 3 where we received no bids. 80% of our wood supply comes off of private land. The impact that the Crown wood supply has on the firewood market is minimal, Mr. Speaker. Today's announcement was a release of long-term allocation that is for the forestry sector. Historically, those mills would hire the contractors to cut the wood, and some of that wood would make it to the firewood market. Because of the current market conditions, Mr. Speaker, a lot of that wood is not getting to where it has traditionally been before. And there is nothing, or very little that the government can do to interfere in that process. If the member opposite needs any indication on how government can interfere in the work of the private market, all he has to do is look at the record of the NDP throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at Bowater, at other industries to try and save them, Mr. Speaker. And what did it result in? Nothing for the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Early Childhood Development. Mr. Speaker, early childhood is the most important developmental phase of life. At this critical time, proper intervention and learning can have a tremendous impact on a child's future development. The Department of Education took on this area well over a year ago. A fundamental part of early childhood development is an early childhood education curriculum. My question to the Minister, has the government developed curriculum for the early childhood development program? And if so, will the Minister table it in this House?
The Honourable Minister for Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And the comment is very accurate that the education for our early learners prior to coming to primary school is fundamental. We recognize, and through statistics we have learned, that about 25% of the children in our province have some level of vulnerability before they come to primary, and our goal at early childhood is to make sure that we are able to help identify early intervention and ensure that the readiness of those students is in place and in a better state of readiness before they come on to primary school. We have, as the member would know, introduced early years centres, and one of the main components of that early years programming is a program for 4-year-olds, and I'd be glad to share that with the member.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, not only would this better prepare and boost healthy development in our youngest Nova Scotians, there will be a long-term economic benefit. For every $1 spent in early education, there is a $2 economic benefit. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll table that. A proper curriculum with proven effectiveness and measurable goals could yield greater economic benefits and, most importantly, make a brighter future for young children. My question to the Minister: has the Minister directed her department to develop measures to determine the effectiveness of the early childhood development efforts?
The Honourable Minister for Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And one initiative that we have taken within the department, it began last year, and it was to use an instrument of assessment for all primary students in our schools, and it was to determine their level of readiness. That instrument was administered by the primary teachers, and it gives us a pretty good picture of the readiness of students, whether it's a cognitive ability, their linguistic ability, their social, emotional, or their physical health. And so those are the things that will help us determine what kind of an early years age 4 program we need so that the concerns that were identified during that assessment are addressed through our program.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, children across the province receive care in many different settings. Some are in preschool, others are in daycare, or in a family home day care setting. In order to develop a curriculum, the government will have to look at professionals across the province to ensure there is uniform training. My question to the Minister: will the attempt to improve the curriculum for early childhood development be a coordinated approach, an integrated approach from a number of key departments?
The Honourable Minister for Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member opposite suggests, this is an effort that does cross departments, government departments. It does include bringing in community. It does include bringing in parents. And I can tell you that as recently as this week, we had a meeting at the Department of Education that involved justice, community services, education, and health, because we recognize that this is bigger than just one department.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. The Minister will remember that he and I and a number of others attended a very heated meeting in Floral. The problem was how to dispose of millions of litres of fracking wastewater. Lafarge cement plant had a plan, and they presented that to the Department of Environment, and were given permission to use 2 million litres of that wastewater. Now, what happens is that wastewater is purified before it goes to Lafarge. It's processed by a company called the Atlantic Industrial Systems. Now, when this was finished, the 2 million litres use, the tests were sent off to Dalhousie, and Dalhousie has completed that testing, and it was deemed safe what come out of that project. So could the Minister of Environment update the House as to the status of this project?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd certainly be glad to provide an update on that project to the member. But just to make a couple of clarifications, factual clarifications on the background here, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the request and the proposal, the proponent, if you will, on this file that has the agreement or the approval for that pilot project with the Department of Environment is actually the AIS Atlantic Industrial Services, Mr. Speaker, not Lafarge. While it is correct that Lafarge was the recipient disposal point for the water, AIS is the company that has the approval for that pilot project, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the pilot project, we do have recently received some test results, Mr. Speaker. We had a number of things being tested, both the water going into Lafarge. That pilot also was going to include results of stack tests to address some of the concerns in the community with respect to air emissions of the treated water, and also the kiln, which is the physical fallout of the process, Mr. Speaker. And we're currently waiting on the test results. Last I heard, we should be getting them shortly on the kiln. Once we have that information, we'll know if the entire process, Mr. Speaker, not just the reverse osmosis water, which I'd like to highlight for everyone, is actually available on our website and has been made available before this pilot kicked off, Mr. Speaker. You certainly don't have to FOI pop my department to get this important information, Mr. Speaker. It is readily available for you.
The honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley on his first supplementary.
That answered my first supplementary, Minister. My second one, I was talking to the manager of Lafarge a few days ago, and I know they are ready to proceed just as soon as permission is given. So I'm just asking the minister, as soon as possible, could they be given that permission so that they can continue?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to commit to as to what the result will be. As I committed to the residents, I made several trips out to Truro area to host public meetings, Mr. Speaker, between January and March of last year, well, this year, I guess, Mr. Speaker, earlier this year. And in those meetings, there was a lot of concern with the disposal of this wastewater. As the Premier, Mr. Speaker, earlier made reference to some of those files that landed on my desk that were backlogged because of the inaction of the previous government, Mr. Speaker. This happens to be one of them, Mr. Speaker. So it did take some time to build the confidence and the trust in the public that the department and the government takes very seriously their concerns. And so, Mr. Speaker, the commitment that was made to the public with this pilot project was that we would assess the test results of this pilot project. So, Mr. Speaker, until we receive the full set of tests and have a chance to review those test results, Mr. Speaker, I won't commit to what the next step will be. But once we do have those test results, if those test results are positive and indicate that the test and the pilot went through successfully, we'll certainly be considering any other applications to continue with the same process, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Inverness.
My question is for the Minister of Justice. While law enforcement does everything it can to keep Nova Scotians safe, the government has a role to play too. In 2011, while in opposition, the now Minister of Economic Development had spoke of funding cuts with respect to the ankle bracelet program. And he said, and I'll certainly table this, Mr. Speaker, this government has now decided at a time, and he's referring to the previous government, this government has now decided at a time when we're seeing increasingly violent crime in our province that they should cut that funding and put that burden on our police officers rather than being on the streets trying to prevent crime from taking place. Now, Mr. Speaker, that member is a trained lawyer, and I would be willing to take his advice on this one. Would the Minister of Justice?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very, very important question. No doubt Nova Scotians want to feel safe in their communities. We all want to feel safe in our communities. Ankle bracelets for offenders who've been convicted and sentenced. The Department of Justice does run an electronic supervision program, as my colleague knows. And we do have ankle bracelets on these offenders. Again, they have been convicted and sentenced by the courts. So the courts certainly is free to order these offenders to wear the bracelets as a condition of their release. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think, and I respect the minister's reply, I think there's opportunity for broader use of these devices. And I know members of the government had concerns at the time of the release of the report on the tragic death of Raymond Tavel. And the Minister of Finance had indicated at the time that there is an issue for the public that goes beyond the recommendations, which I believe she was referring to. It's the issue of whether or not the policies are tight enough to ensure our safety as a society. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister, and I will table that, my question for the Minister, would greater use of electronic monitoring help to ensure a higher degree of safety for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice with just under a minute and a half.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to ensure that all members of this House and all members of the public know and realize that we in the Department of Justice under this government want to do everything we can possibly do to ensure our children, our youth,
our adults and everybody feel safe in their communities. There are a number of conditions that courts can place on someone who is being released on bail, and police help to enforce those conditions. We do use ankle bracelets to supervise high-risk offenders who've been convicted by the courts. That is something that we have done and we are doing. If my colleague is talking about the pilot bail supervision program that was run under the previous government in Halifax, that did include ankle bracelets for those that were out on bail. However, as my colleague understands and realizes, the courts were not using those and were not putting them as conditions to the offenders. Therefore, that program was not
Order,
being utilized.
please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. Oh, pardon me. The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While it was a much lively and informative question period, I wonder if you can take under consideration that we got less than 11 full questions in today, and I'm not pointing a finger at anybody. There's culprits all around. If you could look at that. Plus, Mr. Speaker, in the event, could it also be looked at, in the event if the government doesn't use the 10th question, that question then would fall to the third party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'll take that under advisement and come back with a ruling. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now have public bills for second reading.